Currently we have three main issues. That Dust Devil should be changed in some way, or not, maybe add more health, or not, perhaps attack, or neither. That Linza has too much healing and armor available to her, and that Tetsu Katana is currently far too strong. One thing is clear. As a result, Grief Linza has almost no bad matchups, and she completely crushes aggro. Since the proposed balance changes, there's been a lot of discussion about exactly why that is. Some people like the changes, and others feel that they don't actually address the problems. I wanted to present both arguments and weigh in what I think. Now let me be clear on exactly my stance. If we divide the issues up into percentages, I think 35% of the problem is base attack removal. All decks, not just aggro decks, but all decks that want to build a small amount of base attack to kill efficient, smallish creatures, find it very difficult to exist with current Dust Devil and Karam kicking around. These decks all get absolutely dumpstered from being reduced to one base attack. It stops them dead in their tracks, and this is because creatures like these are basically unplayable on one base attack, and are quite punishing on two, if you stay up at 2. Secondly, without KGP Agent, getting off one base attack is very, very hard. These creatures will kill you, usually even with a weapon, where the opponent is the same and really requires you to have some base attack already, and investing into these cards is very expensive in one way or another, at least far, far more expensive than investing into a Dust Devil. The power levels just don't line up at all. It's so skewed. Dust Devil is just this monstrous value card compared to these others that cost so much more and are just way more conditional. If these other class cards were as easy and desirable to play as Dust Devil, then maybe there wouldn't be as much of a problem. Currently though, Linza's class cards Dust Devil and in my opinion Karam are too strong. You cannot play around Chronicle being on one base attack unless you're Ariane and have the tools to do that. When it happens to other aggro decks, setting up any meaningful chapters is actually very hard to do, and will cost a lot of health. And typically, in the aggro versus control matchup across all card games ever, which is what we're talking about, health is a resource that in Chronicle you can convert into damage. But once you have low health, it can be hard to make more damage, until the point that you can't anymore. And there lies the problem. One of the surest ways to win against an aggro deck is to reduce their AP so that this happens. If you put them down to one base attack, they cannot play cards. And even if it's just for one chapter, you've already won the game. End of discussion. Preferably you do this through Dust Devil, but if you don't find it, or they do happen to play both their KGP agents or game-based attack in some other way, then Karam is literally the nail in the coffin. Sorry, Venescula. Games which open with early Dust Devils and or early Karams will have significantly higher win rates against aggro, as well as every other kind of deck. I think this is 35% of the problem, but if you don't agree, let's wait and see. I'm sure we're soon going to see some stats on the next Jagex livestream. So, I think the main argument against what I'm saying is that this is all very easily countered by weapon destruction. Add 2 copies of Barfight to your deck and Grief Linza won't be a problem, right? Wrong. Very wrong. I tried this with aggro Venescula, which is able to gain more AP than usual aggro decks. And I had 4 weapon destructions in it, and my worst matchup was still Grief Linza. And that's because they're not targeted counters. They are not instants, which in Magic the Gathering is a mechanic where you can interrupt your opponent's turn to spend some leftover mana and do something, which in the case of Counterspell is to say, sorry, that doesn't resolve. Arguing that Barfight counters Dust Devil is like saying rolling a double in Monopoly counters being in jail. It does sometimes, but it's not reliable. Really, the optimal solution is to pay 50 Monopoly dollars to get out, or play KGP agents to counter Dust Devil. But there's 6 base attack removal, just way more than you could ever hope to gain from Penguins. If you're still not convinced, I'd highly recommend watching Judge Neo's new video for a really good related discussion on this, which saves me from going into it here. Links in the description. Base attack reduction is a huge part of the problem. I think about 35%. And if you subscribe to my line of reasoning, this is clearly what's causing the meta to be mostly greedy AP decks, because surely the obvious answer to base attack removal is more base attack. So it's little wonder why strategies that stack lots and lots of AP have become the decks of choice for many players. Because really, that's the most reliable way to minimize the impact of having your base attack removed, and so as a result are the strongest decks to play against Linza. Put it this way, in the words of Zerto on the Chronicle forums, The difference between being reduced from 2 base attack to 1 is 100%, and the difference between being reduced from 5 to 4 base attack is 20%. Generally, the faster and more AP you can stack, the less impact Karam and Dust Devil will have, and the better your deck is against Linza. And even then, it's not actually that bad of a matchup for her, especially when she's going second, because Tetsu Katana is a thing. Regardless though, greedy AP is still the best type of deck to play against her. And I feel like there's this misconception brewing where people feel that Linza is the savior delivered unto us to counter those greedy, sinful AP decks, but actually, it's the other way around. The only reason we're seeing greedy AP decks is because of Linza. And in reality land, greedy AP decks are actually quite weak to all forms of aggro, of which there is none because, oh, Grief Linza. Very broadly speaking, we can classify all aggro decks into these two categories. Traditional aggro, which ranges from self-destructive hyper-aggressive Ring of Recoil stuff to 3-attack decks killing Troll Chuckers. Both typically beat mid-range decks, though not always, especially if they need rebalancing. Looking at you, Hybrid Zan, but generally, we can put an arrow here. Next, those mid-range decks like Hybrid Zan and Demon Morvaren and Strike Ariane, etc., which all gain AP and tend to be aggressive later on in the game, typically beat control decks, which we know more commonly as AP Sustain, win in the final fight style strategies. Finally, the obvious missing link is that AP Sustain is quite good against aggro, to say the least. And ignoring combo decks for now, the big problem is that Grief Linza doesn't care. In theory, she goes here because she does not deal damage and prefers to sustain and win in the final fight, but instead of gaining base attack for that, similarly reduces her rivals, but ultimately it's for the same reason, the final fight, though it does a lot more work during the game than just that. The problem is, she doesn't just beat traditional aggro like AP Sustain does, she absolutely demolishes it. She does this to the point that we might as well just say it's gone. And instead of being beaten by a mid-range strike/damage deck, for example, Demon Morvaren, she has a pretty good matchup against those as well. She doesn't crush them, but she certainly isn't following the triangle. So for a time, we were left with just these two control decks, and this was happening in reality around just before Goldzan became popular this season. What happens next? Well, just like every control vs control meta ever across all card games that have ever existed, the decks just get greedier and greedier to compete with each other, hence the term greedy AP. Now, ignoring Goldzan's presence, which at this time is about to wreak havoc, AP Sustain is now very greedy. Not so much Sustain, much more AP, meaning that it's now more vulnerable to aggro, so aggressive decks make a comeback, resulting in a meta that looks a bit like this. Though eventually, Hybrid Hope Zan, possibly the strongest mid-range deck currently, the Roven Dragon set combo got very popular, and whether you think that combo's good or not, it does make the deck much better specifically versus Grief Linza. Dragon set in the final fight's pretty good card as it turns out. So the final meta at the end of the season looked like this. And if you look closely, the only deck without a bad matchup was Grief Linza, which is why it was quite a popular choice for some players on the final day of the season to make the top 10. You all know who you are, Glenn. Now, in my previous video, I mentioned that myself and Silverchase had some success with aggro decks this season, and this meta explains why. It was only for one day that I found aggro Venescula was performing very well, and admittedly that was when Hybrid Zan was more popular than any other deck. Makes sense. Then due to the self-correcting nature of metagames in CCGs, the next day, Venescula definitely was not quite so good, and if you think about it, you know you've all experienced something like this. Now, to present the other side of the argument. Many people do not think that Dust Devil is the core of the problem. They place more emphasis on the amount of healing and armor available to Linza with double repurpose, 2 full Tetsu, sometimes a stamina potion, and occasionally fledglings. Decks perform so poorly, particularly aggro, because Linza just does not die. Address this issue first, before changing Dust Devil, if it needs changing, and aggro, as well as other decks, will be stronger against it, they argue. Hard to disagree with, right? And that's because it's true, partly. I think this is another 25% of the problem. It's hard to argue that Linza doesn't have too much sustain, but equally, that's just a problem across the whole game. Looking at you, Culinaromancer. It's not a unique Linza issue, but either way, it is an issue. In my experience, even when my aggro deck doesn't get Dust Devil, you know, they don't draw it, or maybe Barfight does hit, the matchup still tends to be Linza favored, though it's usually very close, especially the games I played against Silverchase this season. So I agree fully that sustain is part of the problem, but how do you fix this? The reason why it's a problem is because you can sustain alongside base attack removals such as Karam and Dust Devil, which even helps you do this given the 1 gold reward. This makes it incredibly hard for mid-range decks to compete. Recently, Glenn and I played this matchup 10 times again, except this time we added bar fights to the Strike Ariane to see if things would change. Now, if you agree with my so-called matchup triangle, which now looks less like a triangle and more like a map, the Ariane deck should have a positive win rate against Grief Linza. That doesn't mean it must win every game, but it should win more of them than it loses, right? Results are in: Grief Linza won 7 and Ariane 3. Apparently adding bar fight makes the matchup worse, at least compared to last time, though obviously this isn't true due to variance, but the point I'm illustrating is that Linza can too easily sustain alongside reducing base attack, both of which hurt mid-range decks that want to build AP and deal damage, but each is countered simultaneously. She shouldn't be able to afford this, but put it this way, right? Against traditional aggro, Karam isn't as useful since they don't build as much base attack, though in my experience often still is very useful, but that's not the point, and as a result, she shouldn't need to pay for it as often, and will as a result have more gold and resources to spend on just healing. But against mid-range decks, there should have to be a choice: Karam or sustain. Let me make a strategic decision based on the circumstances. Oh, never mind. Just kidding. Actually, let's just do both. How do you fix this? Jangex have proposed to remove the gold on Ice Warrior, which I'm a big fan of, but also I think sustain should be nerfed as well, and repurpose should have a gold cost. Currently it doesn't, and because of that, you don't have to make a choice what you spend your gold on. And there lies the problem: it's too easy to do both, and I think that this is 25% of the problem. So, what's the final 40% of the problem? That would be Tetsu Katana, possibly the single most broken card in the game, and currently the only insta-pick diamond on our tier list because nothing else compares. This card randomly steals games in Dungeoneering and Constructed, and is by far the biggest problem with Linza currently, in my opinion. From just her starting base attack, Katana offers upwards of 30 damage in 3 hits in the final fight. You can kill your rival from full life in 3 swings for just 6 gold. Can we please just take a moment to appreciate how fucking dumb that is? So you play 5 chapters per match of Chronicle, 4 slots a chapter, that's a maximum of 20 cards a game, which presumably you've used to execute your deck strategy. But wait, oh, Linza's going second. She doesn't give 2 flying shits about how many or the last 20 cards you played, because Tetsu Katana is ridiculous. This card is the definition of broken. It's either insanely rewarding and uncounterable because they're going second, or it does nothing because they're going first and you use weapon destruction. So what a lot of matchups come down to against her a lot of the time is a fucking coin flip on whether you're going first or not. Now, you could raise the gold cost to fix it. Currently, it is clearly hilariously undercosted, and on the Chronicle subreddit, Rasha puts forward some really interesting discussion. Part of what he says is that Dragon Longsword is 3 damage per gold, which it is, and that if Tetsu Katana's cost was increased to 8, then it would be brought in line and also be 3 damage per gold. As much as this is true, and that it's a really good suggestion, because yes, even if Katana was the same damage per gold as D-Long, it would still be a better card than D-Long, which only makes sense because slot efficiency is a thing in Chronicle. It's like comparing Romley Weaklax to Full Tetsu. Obviously Full Tetsu is better, but if you think about it, Romley does offer more health per gold, but that doesn't make it a good card. Changing Katana to 8 gold would be similar. It would be better than D-Long because it's more slot efficient, but currently it's better and cheaper. The problem though with just recosting the card is that there would still be a coin flip on going first or second a lot of the time, which I don't think is healthy for the game. Not to mention that it's just an incredibly boring card. I mean, Kale used to be criticized for not having card text and just being a pile of stats. Yeah. I think what this card needs is a cool effect written on it, something that influences the way the player plays the game. In Judge Neo's suggested balance changes, he mentions that it would be cool if Katana was a smaller weapon, but perhaps came with an upgrade kit that is added to your hand. Maybe 3-3 is a bit too much, but I really like this idea because not only is it thematic, in RuneScape there are two types of Tetsu equipment, tradable versions and stronger untradable versions, but also it reduces the final fight power of the card. If, for example, we made it an 8-2 weapon, it would still be more than good in the final fight, slightly more damage than D-Long in just 2 hits, but also still retain some combo synergy with Char, and actually come with an incentive to actually be played during the game before the final chapter to get value out of the upgrade kit. Overall, I think 35% of the problem is the speed at which Linza can play Dust Devil and Karam in your average match of Chronicle. The small health increase on Dust Devil is not necessarily the best, but certainly the most simple and elegant solution, and removing the gold on Ice Warrior will slow down Karam a bit and maybe force Linza to actually have to choose between sustaining grief. Hopefully. But I'm not sure it's enough. Maybe it is, and we'll have to see, but if not, then the gold on Dust Devil can go, and maybe repurpose can cost gold as well. 25% of the problem is Linza's sustain. Again though, maybe the change to Ice Warrior is enough. Of course, full Tetsu costs 5 currently, and we're already taking 4 gold out the deck. We'll have to see. But if it's not enough though, I'd change Dust Devil and repurpose like I mentioned. The final 40% of the problem is Tetsu Katana, which I think should be made a smaller weapon and come with some kind of other upside that you can't get unless you play Katana before the final fight. That is, though, my punditry on Grief Linza. Thank you very much for listening. This video took about 2.5 days to put together, so do leave a like if you found it interesting, subscribe if you'd like to hear more from me, and I'll see you all again next time.